Before we start, for people that haven't come to one of these webinars before, so there's I can see quite a few Brooks students, which is great, and a couple familiar names, I think, from Loughborough, which is also good. So the format of these webinars is that I get an expert in, and you, the audience, have the opportunity to ask the expert a question on the theme of the webinar, which today is recovery methods from exercise. Now, the reason why this one came about is similar to the last webinar I did with Eric Helms. Shona was a contributor to the book that I recently published, which was Advanced Personal Training Science to Practice. It's the second edition. And one of the chapters within that, the very end chapter, was about post-exercise recovery methods. And this is something that I've actually been asked quite a few questions on social media and via email as well. And I thought, well, it's probably best to get someone that's got a lot more experience in this field than me to answer these questions. And Shona is incredibly experienced in this area of research and was also a physiologist at the Australian Institute of Sport, and has worked with many professional athletes, including Olympic gold medalists and various Olympic sports, team sports. She's done a lot of research on various recovery methods, including sleep. And that's something I've also become interested in over the last few years, because it forms part of my PhD. So I've had quite a few questions come in, and hopefully we'll be able to get through all of the questions that I've received. And also, if you have any questions, then feel free to write those into the chat. We'll just go through them one by one on a first come, first serve basis. Shona, I'd just like you to start us off by, if you could just tell the audience what we are referring to when we talk about recovery as it relates to sport and exercise.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that we probably haven't really got a hard and fast definition on. And when I first started working in the area of recovery and was doing some travel and asking people about what they do for recovery, and we were trying to benchmark recovery, and a lot of time people would come back with, well, what injury are you recovering from? And we were like, no, we're interested in, just recovery from exercise. So how do you, get yourself ready for the next training session or the next event? So the way I kind of think about it is, and this is just my not even definition, just my thoughts, is that recovery is about returning the individual back to homeostasis, so back to balance, and that's from a physical perspective as well as a psychological perspective. So it's really that return to baseline after there's been the stressor of exercise. And I guess, and I'm sure we might talk about this down the track, is how often do you want to do that, and do you want to do that all the time? How necessary is it? But that's what I think of recovery, is that return to baseline.
And just on that, before we get on to some of the questions, that misconception about recovery from injury, is there a common misconception you come across from athletes as it relates to recovery?
Yeah, I think the idea of that you have to recover after every session, or there's certain recovery strategies that only work for certain people. I think some of the athletes that I've worked with have ideas about what they think is optimal for them. But yeah, there's definitely lots of different misconceptions about types of recovery strategies, interventions, how they might work or not work. We know the power of the belief effect, so which is sometimes good and sometimes bad. But yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions out there about recovery and how much you need it and when you need it and those types of things. But I will say, while there is increasing research and experience and anecdotal information in the field, we're still nowhere near we are with things like carbohydrate and hydration for recovery. So we're slowly getting there. We're getting more information, but a lot of the evidence that we have is based on non-elite athletes, and the evidence we have in elite athletes is pretty much anecdotal or experience based.
Cool, thank you. Okay, well, we'll move on to the first question. So this one is from Tom. It didn't include his surname. And this is a really interesting question because it's something that has come up a couple of times in my inbox. So Tom asks, I've seen some people using saunas to promote recovery. Shouldn't this have the opposite effect if ice baths speed up recovery?
A very intuitive, very clever question. I think athletes like the warmth. They like, in my experience, they tend to like spa baths in particular, which can be not as hot and as uncomfortable as a sauna. The heat can have some positive benefits. So I think we've got more research and more experience in the cold as a recovery strategy, and we're now sort of delving more into the heat world as a recovery strategy. It can certainly be relaxing. You can certainly have increases in blood flow. A lot of athletes really like the sensation of being in warmth. The challenge is when, especially with something like a sauna, now infrared, saunas don't tend to have that thermal stress load as much as some of the old school type saunas. But I think there's a point where it goes and I'm sure anyone who's been in a sauna has experienced this. It goes from being nice and relaxing and fun to just being hot and uncomfortable and a physiological stressor. And I think there can be a point where saunas can be used in the recovery period to relax and to increase the blood flow and to maybe have some benefits of passive heating. But then there becomes a point where this is actually like a physiological stress, and your heart rate would be high, your sweat rate would be high, etc. And so then it doesn't, even though it's done in the recovery period, you wouldn't call it a recovery strategy. And some sports, so I know track cycling, Australian track cycling a little while ago was using heat exposure as a passive stressor. So in the recovery period, but not as a recovery technique, as a way to add more physiological stress, like as a passive training effect. So I think we need to be a bit careful with heat, where it can be a recovery strategy, but then it can also be a stressor.
It's really interesting that you mentioned sort of the appropriateness of the time of using it. And a few years ago, I actually supervised a student project. So it had a really interesting idea, and I don't know if anything has been done on this in the research since, where he was using sort of a phased temperature recovery, sort of a periodized approach, where he started the participants in the first, straight after the exercise intervention, with cooling. And then throughout the week, he gradually increased the temperature, and then it became similar to how you might treat an injury or traditionally treat an injury, where you use cold for the initial acute injury phase and then later on introduce heat. Are you aware of any research that's kind of used that periodized approach to sort of cryotherapy?
Yeah, I haven't seen any research, but it is something that I've seen done a lot in professional football in particular. So, the recommendations that we've often given, and again, not really based on anything except our own kind of what we think is physiologically going on, is that, and especially for, I guess, the football that we think of in Australia is more like Australian rules football or rugby, where there's a lot of impact and contact and tackling and damage. We'd sort of look to, okay, immediately post-game would be really, would be primarily cooling strategies, settle down some of that inflammation, help reduce some of the soreness for the next couple of days. And then, so not doing a lot of activity either, not a lot of active recovery. Then the next day they might start to do some of the more active recovery methods, where you do start to warm up a little bit, and then yes, potentially using some of the more heat-based strategies throughout the week as they start to get rid of some of that soreness and some of that damage. And I think that's an approach that can work when you're playing 1 or 2 games a week, where the idea is that you want them to be as good as possible, as quickly as possible. So yes, certainly moving from a really sort of isolate and don't do too much immediately post, through to move a bit more, get a bit warmer as the time progresses post game.
Cool. And on that, you mentioned that. Sorry to jump in on everyone else's questions. I always do this at the start. You mentioned active recovery, and that was something that I included in the recovery chapter that we wrote together. I did have an interesting question on that. It hasn't come in recently, but a couple of cycling coaches suggested to me that any exercise after a race is a stress and they wouldn't recommend it. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, personally, I find, or I've found that a very gentle sort of active recovery of light exercise, it's very least it makes the athlete feel better. But there is a school of thought, or there seems to be amongst coaches, that once they've done an event, they just need to rest completely, i.e. sort of passive rest.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think it may be a little bit sport dependent. So, I mean, one of the things I really tried to do when I was working with swimming with the Australians was to stop them doing such long active recoveries. And, you know, you've got, you know, swimmers who might race, you know, 5 or 6 events over 8 days, heats, semis and finals, and they're doing way more Ks in swim downs than they're doing in racing. And yes, I understand the warm-up component, but the swim down component till they got to a certain lactate, I was like, what are you doing? Like, lactate clears itself when you're sitting down. Now, obviously, if you have to race again within half an hour or an hour, yes, you want to do that active recovery and clear that lactate. But if you're not racing again till the afternoon or till the next day, the only point of an active recovery, as you say in that instance, is to kind of make you feel a bit better. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with a short active recovery, especially if it's off legs. So if you're a football, you know, if it's a football environment, you know, a bike or something like that is not a bad idea. So something that does, make them feel good, you know, does dissipate heat, those kinds of things. But I think we need to be careful that we don't get into this world of massive, you know, extra fatigue, extra Ks, because of these massive warm downs that are just a tradition that I don't think is super necessary.
I completely agree, and it seems to be a cultural thing in some sports, because when I was doing some work with British rowing, we had a similar protocol where they'd finish their piece on the water, and then we'd be measuring lactate, and I think they had to achieve a certain lactate, I believe it was like under 2 millimoles before they could go off and have their lunch. Then some people got there pretty quickly, and then other poor guys were having to like go back on the erg or whatever, or do some cycling, and they'd be there for like half an hour or so. And it struck me then, I was like, I don't know if this is beneficial for recovery or actually it's just eating into their recovery time. But anyway.
I agree. And the swimmers hated it. They were like, they just, you know, they'd get out of the pool and they're lactated before. I think their coaches wanted to be under 3. And so they'd get out of the pool and have to get tested, and it was 4. And then they'd have to get back in the pool and keep swimming. And I'm like, why? Like, who picked that arbitrary number? And also psychologically, that's not great in the recovery period. These guys probably need to eat. They're pretty busy. Ideally, they're going to where I was going to the dining hall, or going to have a meal, winding down and going to bed, not, you know, getting frustrated because they had to jump in the pool again and do a few hundred more meters.
Yeah, I always found it a bit of an awkward one when you'd be taking the lactate and the athlete would ask you why we're doing it, and you kind of because you've been told to do it basically, or I'd been told to do it, so it was always a bit of a difficult one, and it just kind of changed the subject. But anyway, I'll go on to the next question, and this again is something pretty topical that came up a couple of times. So Ant asks, massage guns seem to have become really popular. Is there any evidence that they improve recovery after exercise?
Yeah, I haven't seen any really good quality research. I think there's probably 2 ways to look at them. I think if you don't have access to a therapist, and you don't have, or a physio or a soft tissue therapist, massage therapist, you know, they can be something that can be helpful if you do it correctly. And, you know, a lot of people, in my experience, you know, a little bit is good, a lot is a lot gooder, and so they just keep going until they're, you know, they end up causing themselves some muscle damage. So I think you need to be careful how they're used. And I also think we need to be careful that they're not a replacement for going to see someone when you've actually got something that needs treatment, like going to see a professional. But I think there may be some uses for people who don't have access, whether that's financial access or just in terms of time perspective, to be able to do that. But yeah, haven't seen a lot of research that's good that's looked at those yet.
And that's probably one very similar to massage, in that we've got mixed evidence on it, but there's probably quite a large potential placebo effect there, because it's quite difficult to have like a sham treatment of that.
Yes.
And it's one of those ones that probably has that effect where you feel like it's doing something, and it just feels quite good, as long as you're not using the kind of highest setting and causing more muscle damage. And on that, I think that's something that I don't know if you've observed this, but where I think they maybe could be misused is if you've done, I've seen people in the gym, for example, using them after a heavy session on the highest setting. And I suspect that might actually cause more muscle damage, or at least make it worse anyway.
Yeah, and we see something similar with like complex machines, so muscle stimulation machines, where again, people think the highest setting is good. It's a really unique form of contraction, so often people end up with some serious muscle damage after using some of like a complex machine or something like that, just because it's unfamiliar, and using it on the highest setting might not be the best idea.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where if there's a setting, a lot of people think if you go to the max, that's automatically better. I remember a few years ago when power plates were quite popular, and you see people stick them on the highest frequency and the highest settings for like 60 seconds and thinking more is better. But like most things, particularly with recovery methods, you don't want anything too aggressive. Okay, this is another very topical one, and something actually we've worked on recently together, Shona, with some of the research reviews that we've been doing. Is Jane Carter asks, I've been using a Fitbit to monitor my sleep, and it says that I'm only getting 2 hours of deep sleep on average. How can I improve this? And I've got my thoughts on this, but I'm pretty sure I know what you're going to say, Shona, but it'd be really interesting to get your take on this.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the positives of some of these devices, which is that people are interested in their sleep. It can give them some metrics, and it can hopefully start a conversation with an expert. So that's some of the positives. Some of the negatives of these types of devices is exactly that aspect of where that question has kind of come from. Because when you look at most of the wearables, as a general rule, if they're measuring two-stage sleep, so if you're asleep or awake, they're pretty good. When they start taking that to the next level and saying you're in different stages of sleep, which they're very much inferring, then they start to lose a lot of their validity. So if you have a device that starts to say that you're getting a certain amount of time in deep sleep, that doesn't look like it's enough, I'd be definitely taking that with a grain of salt, because we know that really the gold standard for measuring sleep staging is having electrodes on the scalp, and a Fitbit is a decent chunk away from that. A lot of the wearables, though, are getting better at predicting sleep staging because they're adding other physiological metrics, so like heart rate variability, temperature now in some of the devices. So you put more of the physiological metrics into an algorithm, and you start to get better readings and better data. So, but I would say things like that where it's coming to 4-stage sleep, so REM, non-REM, the stages of sleep, then I would be very cautious about really taking that to heart, because they're probably not super accurate. And like any of the sleep wearables, whatever you're using it for, you're looking really for big changes over time. One night of bad sleep here and there is not the end of the world. We're really talking about, big shifts and big changes. And even if you're someone who legitimately has small amounts of slow wave sleep, there might not be a whole lot you can do about it. It might be that, your room environment's not great, and maybe you're waking up a lot at night, but maybe you're just naturally someone who's not a super deep sleeper. And so then you might be someone that needs a greater duration of sleep to actually feel rested in the morning. But if you wake up in the morning and you feel pretty good, and you feel like you've had a reasonable night's sleep, and you get through the day pretty well, and I'd be ignoring what your device says about stages of sleep.
Yeah, that's completely agree. I think I don't know if you've had this experience with athletes, Shona, but sometimes these sort of wearable devices can maybe cause more problems than sort of be actually helpful for the athlete. Have you come across that at all, where a similar type of question amongst athletes that have started sort of maybe monitoring their sleep and they become a bit more neurotic about it?
Yeah, so there's the idea of orthosomnia, which is out there, which is that we have this perfectionism around sleep that actually causes problems, because we know stress and anxiety isn't good for sleep, and you start to get all these metrics where you're measuring yourself every day, and then you start to get more stress and anxiety about that, which causes you to actually have problems with sleep. One of the things that I have noticed, though, is sometimes I'll give an athlete a sleep device or a watch, like a validated version, and sometimes they just say they hate it. They hate the device and they really complain about it. And what I think might be partly happening is that they're really paying attention to their sleep, probably for the first time. And they're thinking the watch is causing them problems, but what they're actually doing is having some insight, actually thinking about their own sleep. I've also had athletes that say, I get the best sleep ever when I'm wearing that watch because I know you're watching. And I'm like, well, you're supposed to do that all the time. Yeah. But yes, there can be occasions where people wake up and they go, I feel great. Then they look at their device metrics and it says you're not recovered and you're going to have a bad day. It's like, you should go on how you feel, probably more so than what the devices tell you. And for some people, monitoring every day just isn't, it isn't something that works for them. So when we work with athletes, typically what we'll do is come in and monitor for a 2-week block with a device that often doesn't give them any feedback. And then we come in with our own tailored report and give them the feedback that we think will work best for them, so that we don't freak them out if there's really bad data, and we can actually give them a strategy or give them something to do to fix it, because most of the devices in general don't really tell you what you should be doing with your data after you've collected it.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point regarding surveillance, and a pilot study that I attempted a couple of years ago within a professional football club really didn't work, because, as you mentioned there, like, compliance is a really important issue when you give these monitors. You need to get a long-term trend to understand what's happening, and a few of the players, quite rightly actually, when I think about it, they get tested a lot, at the clubs if you're a professional athlete, and they were sort of skeptical, and a couple thought they might have GPS in them, and so people could track them, and a few others were kind of like, I just, when I leave the club, I don't really want to be monitored continuously, and that's obviously not an issue, but sort of for people that are buying them for their own use. But I think in terms of a professional sport, it's probably something that for any sort of the sports scientists that are joining us today might want to think about before they introduce sleep monitoring devices into their battery of testing and monitoring.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And just to add to that, I've done some monitoring with some professional teams in the US, and NFL and NBA, and of course they're not allowed to be. Well, there's all these rules and regulations about being monitored outside of the training environment, and so essentially what you kind of have to do through, with the player agreements and all that kind of stuff, is they essentially have to volunteer. And so then you tend to get the players that are the ones who are more diligent anyway. So you're not probably going to get the players that are the really bad ones who are bad sleepers and out partying. They don't want anyone to know what they're doing. And then, of course, the player agents don't want anyone to know what because, if we identify a sleep disorder or that they're out partying all the time, that might make them less valuable as a player. So then who gets access to that data, who's allowed to see it, who's allowed, who are you allowed to tell what to, becomes a bit of a challenge. And so, where the data is stored, and of course now, as you know, Paul, a lot of these devices are cloud-based, and who has access to some of these superstar, dark sleep data, there's a few hoops to jump through. It's not just give someone a watch and in Australia, like if we're working with, if I'm working with athletes from Olympic teams, like everyone just does it. Coach just says, we're going to do it. Everyone does it. No one complains. It's just, this is what we do for a block of time. But other places it's like, no, you cannot look at my data and no one can see my data.
So I think someone's mic came on there. The next question goes back onto a popular recovery method, and it's really short and concise. And this is from Zags, and he asks, do compression tights actually work?
What a good question. Kinda. Is that a good scientific answer? Kinda. Yeah, kind of, sort of, maybe. Okay, so where we think it does work is around perceptions. In particular, perceptions of recovery. There's pretty good data that compression helps perceived recovery and perceived soreness. There's starting to be some reasonable data now coming out about blood flow, which is, how these things are supposed to work in the first place. They compress the peripheral vasculature so that blood flow goes through the deeper veins, and you get an increased, cardiac output, all that kind of stuff. Now, with good techniques and technologies, we're actually starting to see that. And so there's a bit of evidence in that space. When it comes down to some of the performance testing and some of the other measures around different types of bloods, around muscle damage, etc., some studies, yes, some studies, no. But when you look at the studies, they're all different garments. Typically, there's lots of different garments. People don't report the pressure that's exerted. So how are these garments even fitting? Almost impossible to do a placebo-controlled design because, if you're wearing something tight or not. So the research is pretty fraught with issues. But there is definitely some perceptual benefits, and maybe some benefits if you're repeating performance relatively quickly. If you've got turnaround time of about an hour, there might be some benefits there, and maybe some blood flow benefits, which could potentially be beneficial for travel and those kinds of things. So, the jury's out as to really hard and fast performance. Does it work? And of course, there's so many different performance tests that have been measured, so it's really hard to nail that down. But in terms of making athletes feel better and helping them feel less sore, potentially less inflammation from better blood flow, that's the angle that is a bit more positive.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where it's kind of intuitive, isn't it? It's like when you have an injury and you put, say, like a bandage fairly firmly around it, it kind of just feels better because we're getting activating those sensory receptors.
Exactly.
But one thing that I think it's like with sleep monitoring, that particularly when you work with professional athletes, is that obviously you can't just throw strategies in, and they need to be well considered. And one thing I hadn't considered until I was a participant in a study where the compression garments were medical grade, whereas that if anyone's worn them before, they're really difficult to get on. They are super tight. And one thing that they actually did with me, they're really hot. And this study probably was bad timing. I think it was like middle of July or something. And we were required to wear them in the evening. And it really, I found them, I had to take them off, because it just affected sleep, and which is arguably one of the best recovery methods. So I don't know, have you come across anything like that, Shona, where you've implemented or of athletes that have gone on to implement a so-called recovery method, but it's actually had a sort of detrimental impact?
Yeah, I think one of the things, sticking with the compression angle, is compression tights incorrectly fitted on planes. So we would always recommend medical grade compression for travel, and for that prevention of DVT. And the medical grade ones for travel they're mid-range in terms of pressure. They're not like super, super, super tight, but they're pretty tight. But what I've seen with people wearing compression tights is they think the tighter the better. And because like when you see most medical grade socks, there's a foot in them, usually the toes left out, but there's a foot in them. Whereas when you look at a lot of the compression tights, they stop at the ankle and they act like a giant tourniquet or an elastic band. And so I've seen athletes get off planes with like a gigantic feet, like just cannot put their shoes on because they've basically cut off supply to their feet, doing the complete opposite. So thinking they're doing the right thing by wearing compression on the plane, but have it the wrong size or, too tight, and then causes problems.
Would those be are those like the calf sleeves that you're talking about, where they don't have a foot that just goes over the calf and under the knee?
That don't have a foot.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the just a lot of the compression types, like the standard ones that you can buy, actually do stop at the ankle. And some do come with a stirrup, but that still doesn't really solve the problem. It seems to be like that's why when you look at all the medical grade ones, that's why they're hard to get on, because they basically have they're more like an actual sock with a foot in it. So typically that's what I'd like to use on a plane. And I remember when we first started, we had a research and development partnership with 2XU, which is an Australian company, and I wanted to compare the differences. And of course, I wore a medical grade sock on a flight. I think I was coming over your way, so it was like 100 hours worth of flying, and I had a medical grade sock on one leg and a calf sleeve on the other. And
ever the scientist being very in control.
Couldn't put my right foot into the shoe that had the calf sleeve on, but as soon as I had the medical grade compression one, definitely had much less swelling in the feet. So.
And is there any particular athletes that were they more popular with a certain type of athlete in your experience?
Yeah, probably athletes that have a bit of muscle damage. I think they like, if you're a bit sore from damage, that kind of, as you say, the sensory receptors, it's a nice feeling. You're blocking pain reception by having pressure reception. So, a lot of them like them. And I also find, I don't know what the equivalent is over in the UK, but some of our AFL footballers like them. They like to train in them in the cold, because it does in the winter, because it keeps them kind of warm. But I think they look kind of good in it as well. So I think the athletes that
a vanity component
there. Yeah. If they like to show off a little bit, then they'll like to wear them during exercise. But that is, I guess, a point also, is that there's probably, from what we know from the research, there's probably more benefits to wearing compression in the recovery period than during exercise, which kind of makes sense, because during exercise your blood flow is high anyway, right? So in the recovery period is where you're probably going to get the most benefit. So people that are spending a couple of $100 or £100 on a pair of tights, sort of wasting them by wearing them during exercise. I guess the only benefits, of course, are potential warmth, and maybe a little bit of muscle vibration, minimizing muscle vibration during exercise for wearing during, but most of the benefits seem to be post-exercise. And a lot of those garments don't last a long time. They lose their compression, so saving them for when they work is probably a reasonable idea.
And just finish up on compression, have you got any sort of key points for people that are thinking of buying compression in terms of measurements and what's the best way to kind of go about this?
Yeah, I think the general recommendations, and this is not for travel, this is just for normal wear, is to jump in the smallest pair that you can fit in, kind of like jeans, because they will give and they will stretch a little bit over time. And also, often you get what you pay for. So the more expensive ones often have a stronger weave, so their compressive effects are much better, and they're often better designed. So the seams are in the right places, and they're more comfortable to wear. They're a better fabric. So unfortunately, it seems to be spending a little bit more money is probably the way to go if you can. But yeah, trying them on and really making. Often don't go by the. Actually try them on. Don't go by what it says on the packet for height and weight, because, as you know, a lot of athletes are random sizes, and they can be super tall and super skinny, or tall and muscular, and so really trying them on is a good idea.
Yeah, cool. That's really helpful. Thanks, Shona. A question's actually come in on the chat, and I'll get to this one because it goes back to the idea of temperature, using that as a recovery method. So this, I think it's Vili, sorry if I've got the name wrong, comparing living in cold versus warm temperature country, for example, Finland versus Spain, how does that affect recovery? Is recovery faster and better when living in a country with a warmer temperature?
Yeah, so that is a really good question. And one of the reasons this is a good question across lots of reasons, but is a lot of the research, when you look from the early days around ice baths and contrast, and it came from countries like Finland where there was the sauna ice combination, and a lot of the research has come from the Northern Hemisphere. And some of the things, when I look at having a hot bath before bed, I mean, if I had a hot bath before bed in Australia, I would cook. So it's like, so I do think that, okay, and we don't have as much research coming out of the Southern Hemisphere, so everyone reads this stuff about having a warm bath. I'm like, well, that doesn't always work for different environments. But I do think that the idea around the environment is really important. So, for example, working with sailors, Olympic sailors, and they could be sailing anywhere in the world and it could be absolutely freezing and they get wet and they're in the wind and they're cold. The last thing I'm going to do is put them in an ice bath, right? So for them, getting them back to homeostasis or back to balance would mean warming them up. And we know, particularly in that world, it's more around the comfort factor, but it's also around helping people sleep. Obviously, if it's too hot or too cold, it's really challenging to sleep. So I think whether you live in a warm or a cold country, I think that just dictates the type of strategy that you might do. I don't know if it's better or worse, depending on where you live. I think being too hot can be a real challenge. I think really hot environments that you're not used to. We had some rowers when I was living in Canberra, which is actually cold. They would always go over to Europe in our winter, your summer, to train. And so many of them, they had to completely alter their training times because it was too hot. And they were having problems sleeping, and then there were some of the doctors handing out sleeping tablets, and it all just got a bit of a mess because they were training at the wrong times of the day and it was actually too hot. So I think it doesn't matter if it's hot or cold per se, as long as you're adjusting your recovery strategy to always think back to homeostasis and back to balance.
Yeah, I think that was another argument that came up, what I mentioned previously about a couple of cycling coaches that were saying if you do like an active recovery, you're not allowing your body temperature to drop back down to norms. But like you just mentioned, it all depends on the environment you're doing it in. So if you're in a air-conditioned gym, for example, you're getting the benefit in terms of the blood flow and feeling better, but you're not actually elevating core temperature. So I think that is important, but context is important, like you say. What environment have you just come from, and what environment are you going to recover in? Another question has just come in there. How do we know if we've got a muscle spasm, cramp, or sprain? I think that question is based on what we mentioned earlier when we were talking about compression, and I briefly mentioned injury. That's I think if you've got a sprain, you kind of, if you're fairly in tune with your body, you probably know what's muscle damage versus what's an injury. But have you got any thoughts on that, Shona?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, if you've had a cramp or a sprain or a spasm, you'll know about it. But recovering from them, and I guess it does depend on what it is, if it's a spasm, a cramp, or a sprain. It's probably a little bit out of my sphere of what I work in. Typically, that would be more a physiotherapy sort of deal with that. But if we're talking sort of more around the muscle damage angle, it seems like maybe from some of the research that the hot cold tends to work reasonably well for the muscle damage, and that's probably due to the increase in blood flow that you get from going from the hot to cold. So you do get changes in blood flow when you're in cold water. So obviously the blood flow goes to protect the heart and lungs and the vital organs when you're in freezing cold water. And then when you get out, the blood flow redistributes to the hands and the feet, which is why quite often I've seen athletes have competitions, which is really dangerous. We stop them, but they try to have competitions to see who can stay the longest in the cold water. And it's like they can stay in there for a pretty long period of time because their core temperature doesn't change that much in the cold. It might drop a little bit. But what happens is when they get out, then their core body temperature really drops because the blood flow goes back to the hands and feet and their core gets really cold. And we used to see them. I used to walk to the dining hall and I'd see people shivering in the middle of summer in the dining hall. And I was like, oh, what have you guys done? Like, you've obviously been in an ice bath for way too long because you've had a competition. And so I think that idea of blood flow can be increased with even cold, but I think that hot cold seems to have good effects on so moving from hot to cold has good effects on blood flow and potentially inflammation, and that might be something that's helpful for muscle damage / moving down this sort of cramp sprain area. The only thing we really do avoid is hot, a hot, really hot, warm environment if you've got an acute injury. So within 24 to 48 hours, typically the advice has always been to stay away from anything too hot.
Okay, cool. That makes sense. And again, that probably comes from the competitive nature of athletes, doesn't it? Like I mentioned previously, like on settings, maximum must be better. And the same goes with sort of cryotherapy. If a couple of minutes is good, then 10 minutes must be better. But of course, it can be quite dangerous. Have you actually ever experienced something where it's been dangerous for the athlete, or they've actually had a really bad experience from cryotherapy after exercise or competition?
I've seen one in research, but it was actually, I think, a panic attack. We thought they had asthma, but I think it was actually a panic attack about getting into cold water. And then we've had a couple. I work at obviously won't name names, but work at the Australian Open at the tennis. And when there's been a couple of instances where there's been the odd occasion where there's been, it's hard to know whether they've actually passed out in the ice bath or getting into the ice bath, but we've had a couple of fainters, but nothing too major. But often what we see, especially at the Australian Open in Melbourne in summer, it's 1 billion degrees. People are often they come from Europe, they're not well prepared, they have a bit of heat issues, and they think they're going to jump straight in the ice bath, which is actually usually a very good idea. Cooling, if you have heat stress, the best thing to do is jump in cold water. But sometimes we see some issues with blood pressure, etc. So that's kind of the only real thing that I've seen. And, people can stay in cold water too long, but usually, the approach that we used to take was that people had to be supervised for the majority of the time, because sometimes they do silly things.
And would that be similar to nutrition, where we often recommend athletes don't try something new in competition, they stick to what they know? Would you recommend a similar approach with like recovery methods?
Yeah, 100%. And you'd often see, so when I was looking after recovery at a few Olympics, and we'd have, not most of the athletes I would have had some contact with through some way or form through the Institute of Sport, but there'd be some that were maybe Europe-based or whatever, and they'd come in and they'd see all these other athletes jumping in ice baths, and they'd start asking questions. And I'd be like, have you ever done this before? And they're like, oh, no. And I'm like, Olympic Games is not the place to be trying this to find out if you like it or not. And so we generally say, okay, let's find some strategies that you've done before that you're familiar with.
Cool. And I think probably because I just mentioned nutrition, a question came up there. Can you talk a little about nutrition or supplements for sports recovery? Quite a broad question, but any key points?
Yeah, look, I think, again, have been very fortunate to work with really, really good dietitians in this space. And so I typically like to give these sorts of things to the real experts. But I think there's probably been a shift away from supplements per se to more just, healthy, normal eating, and getting nutrition from real food. The use of supplements can come in, of course, when there's problems with access, problems with appetite, or not really enjoying certain types of food. A supplement can be a nice way if you're not that hungry to get some calories in. I think we know some pretty standard information around the importance of protein post-exercise, replacing carbohydrate, and of course, hydration post-exercise, particularly depending on the time frame until next activity. But I think, my perspective has been that, supplements can take them or leave them, except in, certain circumstances and for specific supplements.
And I think the other one, for some of the audience that maybe aren't working with professional athletes and more of the general population, is to consider what they're training for as well, because I have had clients and people ask me about recovery shakes after going to the gym. Now, if you're a professional athlete and you've got limited time between competition or between training sessions, then they're probably a good idea to replenish carbohydrate stores and get the protein in. But if you're only training 2 or 3 times a week, and you've just kind of got general fitness goals, I'd say they were unnecessary, because you've got ample recovery time between your training sessions. So I think that distinction is quite important between what the professional athletes do and even what really good amateur athletes do, as opposed to people that are just kind of training for general health and fitness benefits.
Yeah, and I think we've all seen those people who go to the gym who, and kudos to everyone who turns up to a gym. I'm not sort of having a go at people, but sometimes you see people do half an hour on the bike at, pretty low intensity, and then go off and have the Gatorade or the Powerade or something to replace all the fuels that they've used. And I'm like, well, you haven't even come close to using the calories that you've just consumed. So it absolutely depends on what your goal is. For some people, they need to actually have more calories because they want to gain muscle, or they want to gain lean mass. So I think, there's the nutrition aspect is so nuanced, as you know, Paul. Like, there's so many different areas and different ways of really individualizing it.
Yeah, for sure. The next question goes back to technology and wearable technology. Damien Hunt asks, there are a lot of smartwatches that measure heart rate variability. Is this a good indicator of fatigue and recovery? That's a really good question.
Yeah, it is. I don't know if I've got a really good answer for you. I think I always used to say, so I used to work with a physiologist called Dave Martin, and we still catch up, and he's like, to me, he's like the doyen. Like, and he used to say to me, heart rate variability for predicting fatigue is like astrology. You read into it what you want, and you get the result, and then you determine from that what it really means. So I've always had this kind of thing about heart rate variability maybe not being amazing, and we know you sort of really have to kind of control, you have to, to do it really properly, you need to be at rest and, sitting to standing, all that kind of thing. But sleeping heart rate variability probably has some interesting aspects to it, because it's obviously less, you've got less external distractions, and it's probably more, pure physiology based. So I think there might be something there in heart rate variability, but it's one of those things that, I think there might be some merit to it, but it's going to be highly individualized.
And is that something that is being used or is popular amongst athletes? And is there a particular sort of subgroup? I know in my experience, like endurance athletes particularly cyclists, tend to be a bit more geeky with tech and like data. Is that in your experience as well? Definitely. Cyclists, triathletes.
I think now probably getting, some of the CrossFit athletes are, with their association with Whoop, there's definitely a lot more interest in those metrics. And you just see it in social media now, people sharing their data on social media, and it can be a challenge.
And on that, I think what's also important for anyone that's considering buying one of these devices is that so similar with the sleep staging that we discussed earlier, is that the algorithms that manufacturers use aren't necessarily published. So it's essentially a bit of a black box. So your data goes into it, and then it spits out a number on, and each device has got a different metric to to kind of state what your recovery status is. And going more towards a question, would you say that this could potentially hinder your perceived recovery, Shona, if you get sort of this, not alongside a sleep metric, you might get sort of an ANS charge, for example, that says your sleep was poor and therefore you're under recovered. And do you think that could have sort of a nocebo effect?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a massive risk in that. So you go from some of these devices saying, yeah, two-stage sleep, pretty good. 4-stage sleep, not as good. And then some random metric of readiness or recovery, like no idea. We have no idea how that's calculated. It may be good, but it may not be good. And so that's where I always tell people to, and to be careful when you're looking at that data. Like I would always encourage athletes to be really careful about, if you're racing an Olympic final and you wake up in the morning and you see that you're not ready, you don't want to see that, right? So you probably don't want to be looking at certain things at certain times. You can do nothing about it. It's not going to help you. The only thing it can do is potentially make you feel worse. So, I mean, on the other hand, if it comes back and says you've had an amazing night's sleep, you're going to be fantastic. But I would say the majority of athletes I know aren't going to be sleeping well the immediate night prior to a really, really important event. So I think we do need to be careful with that. Some of the devices, especially if we're using from a research perspective, so we're starting to use Oura Ring just for some research, particularly in female athletes, because of the temperature data across the menstrual cycle. If we buy the Oura Teams, we can block what people can see on their app. And so that's obviously important for a research perspective, but I think that can be also really important for people in certain phases of competition or training where you just don't want them to see certain things.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And for anyone that's considering buying one of these devices and looking into it, you also have to remember that heart rate variability doesn't just respond to the stress of exercise and physical activity. It doesn't distinguish between the type of stress you encounter in day-to-day life, physical, emotional stress. So it just gives you this one number. So just using it purely based on your training, I think you've got to take other factors into consideration as well. But I think heart rate variability is probably a webinar in itself because of it's quite a complex subject.
And I will say though that some of the devices are actually getting quite good, and I have an Oura Ring and I wear it not so much just because I feel like I need to know how to use these devices. I need to understand all the intricacies of them. Now, I don't class myself as a heavy drinker at all, but I went away on holidays, had a week's leave, and I probably for a week was classified as a heavy red wine drinker for about 5 days. I probably was over the 2 standard drinks a day, and gosh, you could pick it up on my data on the Oura Ring, and you can see it. A lot of people say alcohol, you can see it clearly. And there's a couple of papers now that are coming out now that we have access to big data. In the past, we didn't have a lot of access to people's sleep, but now we can get access to Apple Watches and Oura Rings and all this stuff, and we're able to, and Whoop and these devices, and we can get that data. You can start to see people's patterns, and it is remarkable how you can see, alcohol is a physiological stressor, right? And so, that does show up in the sleep metrics.
Yeah, I've actually heard someone talking about it the other day, and I think I've seen a paper on it that in terms of alcohol seems to be really easy to kind of affect heart rate variability, and it's probably there's probably an interaction there where you're getting the stressor of the alcohol, which is affecting your recovery and your sleep as well. So it's kind of like a really anti-recovery strategy to go and drink alcohol after exercise. Probably one of the worst things you could do.
Yeah, and the effects, I think at that same paper that, the effects of alcohol was, training didn't have the same effect on heart rate variability. The only thing that came close to the effect of alcohol on heart rate variability was being sick, was illness. So it was really powerful. And I think there was something like 5 million data points or something. It was a crazy, one of those crazy studies. So there's definitely something in that. And that sort of goes back to using your wearables on an individual, basis. So I can tell if I've, for me, 2 wines is well and truly enough, and that's enough to affect my sleep based compared to what I normally have. So comparing yourself to yourself is a good way of using the devices. Don't compare to other people and don't compare to other devices.
Yeah, that's really interesting aspect of the wearables as well, is that they're generating so much data on a mass level, on a population level now, that we can kind of start to see trends in terms of sleep, and as you just mentioned there, between heart rate variability and alcohol consumption. And I think in the future that's going to be really interesting I know that in the UK we've got like the biobank, which is like a mass data set of physiological data, and these companies using this data to not only improve their own devices but also kind of to look for patterns and trends in physiological data. Is interesting.
Yeah, it is super interesting. Yeah.
So we're almost at the end. So I'll just ask if anyone's got sort of a really pressing question that they'd like to ask Shona before we finish up, then feel free to do so. Either come in on the mic, I've just enabled them, or type into the chat. Whilst we wait for that, I just want to say thanks very much, Shona, for giving your time up to answer those questions and go through the strategies. It's really useful for, as I mentioned at the start, for students, and also now I'm getting people that are just really interested, not necessarily sports science students, but just interested in elements of sports science that we're starting to see kind of creep into the mainstream market, and particularly with like social media, wearables and things like that. Just a final question from me. If I know these are always sort of difficult ones to answer, but in terms of like, if you were given an athlete expenses and you've got basically limited time to get them recovered, what would be sort of your top 3 strategies for recovery?
Yeah, I would, I think about recovery pyramid. I think the bottom of the pyramid as being sleep and mental recovery. Nutrition and hydration would also be very closely after that. And then I would probably, it's a bit of a jump then between to the next ones, but I'd probably go something like your water immersions after that. Water immersion, or maybe massage, depending on the requirements. But I think what we see is people go for the fancy, shiny, blingy things, and maybe avoid the basics, which are not as fun, but things like good sleep, good nutrition, and then something like a water immersion, compression, or massage would be sort of the next level.
And on that sort of fancy, shiny, blingy thing, is there anything, any trends that you're seeing at the moment with athletes, and something that they're keen to do or are asking you a lot about for recovery?
Yeah, the thing I'm probably getting asked most about now is heat. And I know that was an early question here. Infrared, and not just saunas, but things like the beds, and the different LED lights and stuff like that. So heat is, and I think they're marketing that really well in the States in particular. So getting a lot of questions around and interest around the sort of heating now, moving a little bit away from cold and moving a little bit more into heat.
Cool. It's interesting, isn't it? Like in sports, it's like sports nutrition. We seem to get these sort of trends that come in and out. I remember a few years ago, it was all about compression, and then like it's massage guns, and then it seems to be more heat now. Final one for you, Shona. Do you have any good, this is a question that's just come in. Do you have any good recommendations for a book on recovery?
Yes, and Ben's just put the chapter. I also put a chapter. There's not many really pure recovery books, but there's I did a chapter in David Joyce's Human High Performance 2 book, and that's probably got a range of other stuff in it that might also be interesting. So yeah, that's probably, but to be honest, I think there's probably a reasonable amount of resources on the web as well. And I did also see, Ben, yes, that is the paper, heart rate variability, the 5 years and 9 million measurements. That's the one. So
Thanks
yeah,
for
that's
that,
yeah.
Yeah, for anyone, if you look in the chat, Ben has just included a couple of useful links there for you to go to. One on that paper we mentioned about heart rate variability, and the other on a recovery chapter. So thanks very much, Shona, once again. Really useful.
Pleasure.
I hope all the students and audience found it really useful. Yeah, we'll see you soon. Thanks everyone for joining in.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for the questions. Cheers.
Cheers,
Thanks, Paul. Bye.
Okay, bye.